I want you to pause for a moment and really sit with the gravity of what is unfolding right now. Because this is not just another headline, not just another diplomatic spat between neighbors, and certainly not just another round of posturing that will blow over by next week's news cycle. What we are witnessing is the fracturing of the most integrated bilateral trade relationship on planet Earth, a relationship that generates $2.6 billion in goods crossing the border every single day. And the consequences are already materializing in automotive plants across Michigan, energy markets in Alberta, and supply chains that employ millions of workers on both sides of the 49th parallel. I have spent decades watching power from the inside, first as a Republican insider who helped architect the legal frameworks that govern how institutions respond to executive overreach, then as a constitutional lawyer who has argued cases about the limits of presidential authority. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, what Justin Trudeau said 5 minutes ago, that declaration that Canada won't back down on trade, is not diplomatic theater. It is a calculated statement of sovereignty from a leader who has concluded that the cost of capitulation exceeds the cost of confrontation. So I want you to ask yourself three questions. First, what happens when your largest trading partner, a nation that supplies 60% of your crude oil imports and 85% of your electricity imports, decides that reliability in the relationship no longer exists? Second, what happens when CEOs at General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, companies that have built their entire North American production model around seamless cross-border integration, suddenly face the prospect of 25% tariffs on components that cross the border 6 or 7 times during a single vehicle's production? And third, what happens when the Toronto Stock Exchange opens tomorrow morning and Canadian pension funds, which manage $1.7 trillion in assets, begin making decisions about American exposure based on the assessment that political risk now outweighs market returns? These are not theoretical questions. These are being answered right now in real time. Systems don't collapse overnight. They erode slowly through moments exactly like this. And the erosion we are watching began 72 hours ago when President Trump issued an ultimatum that treated Canada not as an ally with the longest undefended border in human history, but as a subordinate expected to comply with demands on a weekend deadline. For more than 75 years, the United States and Canada built an economic infrastructure so integrated that economists struggled to find historical parallels. Not because of sentiment about shared values or cultural similarities, but because it made profound economic sense for both nations. The Great Lakes Manufacturing Corridor, stretching from Chicago through Detroit to Toronto and Montreal, became a single economic unit where components moved back and forth across the border multiple times during production cycles. An engine block cast in Windsor crosses to Detroit for machining, returns to Canada for assembly, then crosses again as part of a finished vehicle destined for American dealerships. The system worked because it was predictable. Canadian suppliers knew they had reliable market access. American manufacturers knew they had reliable components. The infrastructure on both sides, the bridges and rail lines and customs facilities and regulatory harmonization, all of it represented decades of investment that created mutual dependency so deep it became invisible. And mutual dependency, when it functions properly, creates the kind of boring stability that allows businesses to make 20-year capital investments with confidence. Prime Minister Trudeau could count on cross-border trade generating tax revenue that funds healthcare and infrastructure. Michigan manufacturers could count on Canadian auto parts arriving on schedule every day without disruption. The system hummed along, generating prosperity so consistently that most people never thought about it. That boring predictability enabled Toyota to build a plant in Cambridge, Ontario that supplies engines to factories in Kentucky and Indiana. It enabled Suncor Energy to develop oil sands projects in Alberta with the confidence that pipeline access to American refineries would remain stable. It enabled American utilities in states like Minnesota and Vermont to integrate Canadian hydroelectric power into their grids, knowing that supply would be constant across decades. When trade negotiators talked about the USMCA, the successor to NAFTA, this integration was what they meant. Not just tariff elimination, but regulatory alignment, labor standards, environmental protocols, and dispute resolution mechanisms that allowed goods, services, and capital to move with minimal friction. The infrastructure represented more than just physical assets. It represented institutional trust built through generations of cooperation. But that assumption of predictability, that confidence in the boring stability of a relationship that predates most people's grandparents, has been systematically shattered in the span of 72 hours. What triggered this moment wasn't a misunderstanding about border security or a genuine policy dispute that could be resolved through the normal channels that exist precisely for this purpose. It was an ultimatum delivered via social media, designed for maximum public humiliation and minimum diplomatic flexibility. Not a request for enhanced cooperation on fentanyl interdiction, something Canada was already doing. Not a proposal for joint border security initiatives, something both countries have pursued for decades. A demand that Canada immediately stem migration flows across a border where irregular crossings represent a tiny fraction of what occurs on the southern border, backed by the explicit threat of 25% tariffs on all Canadian exports if compliance wasn't achieved within 72 hours. The demand wasn't framed as the opening of a negotiation between partners. It was framed as an order from superior to subordinate, and it came with a deadline calibrated to humiliate. 72 hours. As if the fundamental reorientation of border policy and the deployment of enforcement resources were decisions that could be made over a long weekend without legislative input or provincial coordination. For Trudeau, a prime minister already facing domestic political challenges and leading a minority government dependent on opposition support, the calculation was straightforward but brutal. Agreeing to the demand would effectively acknowledge that Canadian sovereignty on matters of border security is subordinate to American political cycles, and whatever demands might arrive next week or next month based on Trump's assessment of his domestic political needs. Refusing the demand would trigger tariffs that economists immediately projected would reduce Canadian GDP by 2.5% in the first year alone, devastating automotive and manufacturing sectors that employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians. Both options were catastrophic, but one preserved the fundamental principle that Canada makes its own decisions about its own territory. The other sacrificed sovereignty for temporary relief that could be revoked the moment Trump decided it served his political purposes. And that is the line Canada refused to cross. Within 90 minutes of Trump's tariff announcement, Trudeau was on television delivering a statement that was notable not for its emotion, but for its calculation. Canada won't back down on trade. 5 words that represented a fundamental strategic choice. And within hours of that statement, the consequences began cascading through a system that had operated on the assumption of stability for 3/4 of a century. Within hours of the announcement, the effects began cascading through the system in ways that revealed just how integrated and fragile this economic infrastructure actually is. In Oshawa, Ontario, where General Motors operates an assembly complex that produces pickups and SUVs for the North American market, plant managers were suddenly running scenarios on what happens when a 25% tariff makes their production costs uncompetitive with plants in Mexico or the American South. The math was brutal and immediate. The tariffs would add approximately $12,000 to the production cost of every vehicle assembled in Canada and sold in the United States. GM couldn't absorb that cost. Dealers couldn't pass it entirely to consumers without losing sales to competitors. The only logical response was production cuts and eventual plant closures. The company didn't need to announce it publicly. Everyone in Oshawa already understood what the tariffs meant. In Windsor, across the border from Detroit, where automotive parts suppliers employ tens of thousands of workers producing everything from steering systems to electrical harnesses, executives were fielding calls from American automakers asking whether components could be rerouted through Mexico to avoid Canadian tariffs. The answer, in most cases, was no. Not quickly. Not without massive capital reinvestment. Not without abandoning facilities that represented decades of specialized expertise. When a factory stops, there's no narrative that fixes it. And it's not just automotive. The energy sector, which represents the single largest component of bilateral trade, faces disruption that will affect American consumers directly and immediately. Canada supplies 3.8 million barrels per day of crude oil to American refineries, predominantly heavy crude that flows to facilities in the Midwest and Great Lakes region specifically designed to process it. Enbridge operates pipelines that move 2.9 million barrels daily from Alberta to refineries in Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan. Marathon Petroleum's refinery in Detroit, which processes 140,000 barrels per day of Canadian crude, suddenly faces the prospect of either absorbing cost increases that make its operations uncompetitive or scrambling to find alternative feedstock that its facility isn't optimized to process. The numbers aren't theoretical. The American Petroleum Institute released projections within 48 hours estimating that tariffs on Canadian crude would increase gasoline prices across the Midwest by 30 to 45 cents per gallon within 60 days. That's not modeling future possibilities. That's math based on existing contracts and supply relationships that are now disrupted. In states like Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, where Canadian crude and refined products are deeply integrated into local energy markets, the price spikes will be immediate and unavoidable. But the electricity sector is where the disruption reveals how interconnected these systems have become. Canada exports approximately 60 terawatt hours of electricity annually to the United States, predominantly hydroelectric power from Quebec and Manitoba flowing to New England and the upper Midwest. Vermont gets 70% of its electricity from Canadian sources. New York imports significant amounts to meet peak demand in New York City. These aren't luxury purchases. These are essential grid stability imports that prevent brownouts and blackouts. The tariffs don't just increase costs, they create uncertainty about whether supply will continue, forcing American utilities to activate expensive backup generation or negotiate crisis contracts with alternative suppliers who know they have leverage. As the disruption spread, something unusual started happening in Washington. Not in press conferences or congressional hearings, but in private phone calls and emergency meetings that revealed just how unprepared the administration was for the consequences of its own decisions. Executives from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, representing companies responsible for 95% of U.S. auto sales, were calling senators and representatives explaining that the tariffs weren't leverage against Canada. They were self-inflicted wounds on American manufacturing. The CEO of Ford, Jim Farley, released a statement noting that 25% tariffs on Canadian components would force the company to idle production at plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky within 90 days. Not because of labor issues or demand problems, but because the economics of production would no longer make sense. Stellantis followed with similar warnings about its plants in Indiana and Illinois. These weren't vague threats designed to influence policy. These were operational realities that executives were legally obligated to disclose to investors and shareholders. Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, who represents a state where automotive manufacturing directly employs 175,000 workers and indirectly supports another 500,000 jobs, released a statement calling the tariffs economically catastrophic and demanding immediate reversal. Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin, where Canadian electricity imports keep rates stable and manufacturing depends on cross-border supply chains, warned that the tariffs would devastate communities across her state. The Business Roundtable, representing CEOs of America's largest companies, convened an emergency session and released a letter signed by 180 executives warning that the tariffs would trigger recession in border states and significantly damage the broader economy. These weren't partisan actors. These were the same business leaders who had largely supported Republican economic policy and who now found themselves in the surreal position of explaining to the administration that you can't threaten your way to prosperity. The Chamber of Commerce issued economic analysis suggesting that if the tariffs remained in place for 6 months, the cumulative impact on American GDP could exceed $180 billion and cost 850,000 jobs directly, with another 1.2 million jobs affected indirectly through supply chain disruptions. This is where the administration's fundamental misunderstanding of leverage becomes starkly clear. The assumption seemed to be that threatening Canada's economy would force Trudeau to capitulate because Canada needs access to American markets more than America needs Canadian imports. Both premises were wrong. Canada does depend on American markets, which is precisely why Trudeau's refusal to capitulate signals how seriously Canada views the sovereignty issue. And America's dependence on Canadian imports, particularly in energy and automotive sectors, means the tariffs inflict immediate, tangible harm on American workers and consumers. When Canadian officials announced they were exploring retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion worth of American exports, targeting products from states and districts of key Republican lawmakers, they weren't escalating emotionally. They were making a calculated strategic move. And here's what those frantic phone calls and emergency meetings were beginning to understand. Once the retaliatory cycle begins, once Canadian suppliers start rerouting their products to European and Asian markets, once American manufacturers start moving production to Mexico or the American South to avoid tariffs, the reversion to the previous system becomes impossible. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is understanding how power actually works in the modern international system and why the assumptions driving this administration's approach are fundamentally misaligned with how alliances and economic partnerships actually function among developed democracies. For decades, American power rested on two pillars: unmatched military capabilities and perceived institutional reliability. The first gave Washington leverage in security matters and crisis situations. The second gave allies and trading partners confidence that cooperation with the United States represented a stable, predictable, and ultimately beneficial long-term strategy, even when specific negotiations were difficult or when American demands were aggressive. When those two pillars reinforced each other, the system worked extraordinarily well. American security guarantees made trade relationships and financial integration feel secure. Predictable American policy made long-term capital investments and supply chain integration seem rational, even when they created dependencies. What Trump is doing now systematically undermines the second pillar without enhancing the first, and doing so with America's closest ally makes the signal impossible for other nations to ignore. Military dominance is utterly irrelevant to trade relationships between peaceful democracies sharing the world's longest undefended border. You can't coerce cooperation and expect stability. You can't force trust through threats. Once you understand this framework, everything that's happening makes complete sense. The confusion and surprise aren't in Ottawa or Toronto. The confusion is in Washington, where policymakers seem genuinely shocked that treating your most reliable ally like a hostile negotiating partner produces hostile responses. Canada's response to the ultimatum wasn't emotional or irrational, despite how it might be portrayed by administration officials searching for face-saving narratives. It was the only rational response available to a government that understands the difference between short-term economic pain and the long-term strategic disaster of establishing the precedent that Canadian sovereignty is negotiable based on American political calculations. Trudeau looked at the two options, calculated the costs of each, and chose the option that preserves Canada's ability to make independent decisions rather than becoming a client state that adjusts policy based on whatever demand arrives next from Washington. And here's the part that should absolutely terrify American strategic planners. Trudeau is being proven correct in real time. Within 72 hours of his statement, Canadian officials had preliminary discussions with European trade representatives about expanding CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the EU. Canadian energy companies were in talks with Asian buyers about long-term contracts that would divert crude oil exports away from American refineries. The Ontario government announced an emergency working group to help manufacturers find alternative markets and reroute supply chains. These aren't bluffs or negotiating tactics. These are rational business and policy decisions based on the assessment that American market access is no longer worth the subordination and instability that apparently comes with it. Once trust is replaced with contingency planning, the old system never quite comes back. European buyers are now getting access to Canadian products they were previously priced out of. Asian markets are building relationships with Canadian energy producers they didn't have before. Canadian policymakers are diversifying their economic relationships in ways that reduce existential dependency on American markets. The real story isn't the tariffs themselves. The real story is the strategic reorientation those tariffs have triggered. Supply chains don't just pause and restart like a video on pause. They reroute. And once rerouted, the economic logic that drove the original configuration no longer applies with the same force. American manufacturers built production models around Canadian integration because that configuration made sense when the relationship was stable and predictable. Now the relationship is demonstrably unstable and unpredictable, which means those production models have transformed from strategic assets into strategic liabilities. The capital investment doesn't vanish, but its value erodes rapidly. A factory optimized for components you can no longer reliably access is worth a fraction of one with diversified, stable supply. This affects your job if you work in automotive, energy, or any of the dozens of industries dependent on cross-border integration. It affects your heating costs if you live in states dependent on Canadian natural gas. It affects your electricity rates if you live in Vermont or Minnesota. It affects your retirement savings if your pension fund holds positions in companies whose business models were built on assumptions of trade stability that no longer hold. The abstraction of trade policy becomes very concrete very quickly when plants start announcing production cuts, when gasoline prices spike 40 cents per gallon, when utility companies start warning about rate increases to cover the cost of replacing reliable Canadian supply with more expensive alternatives. And this is where it becomes impossible to find a clean exit from the situation the administration has created for itself and for the country. Option A is escalation. Maintain the tariffs, expand them if Canada retaliates, attempt to force compliance through sustained economic pressure. The problem with this approach is that it accelerates the strategic decoupling that's already underway. Every week the tariffs remain in place, Canadian exporters find alternative markets. European buyers who previously couldn't compete with American proximity now have an opening created by American policy. Asian energy companies that were shut out of Canadian crude markets now have access. Once those relationships are established, once new supply chains are built and new contracts are signed, they don't dissolve simply because tariffs are lifted. The trade that gets diverted doesn't automatically return when the policy changes because new infrastructure has been created and new economic logic applies. Option B is retreat. Lift the tariffs, claim some modest face-saving concession from Canada on border cooperation that both sides know is largely symbolic, and attempt to restore the previous system. The problem with this approach is that institutional trust has been shattered. Canadian policymakers now have empirical evidence that American trade policy can change overnight based on domestic political calculations that have nothing to do with Canada's actual behavior or any genuine policy dispute. That knowledge fundamentally changes how they make decisions going forward. It makes diversification rational. It makes contingency planning prudent. It makes long-term commitments to American economic integration risky in ways that will affect Canadian policy for years or decades. The administration is trapped between two equally damaging options: escalate and accelerate the permanent decoupling of North American trade relationships, or retreat and validate Canada's assessment that American policy is too volatile to build long-term strategy around. History and pattern analysis suggests they will choose escalation because this administration has repeatedly demonstrated that avoiding the appearance of weakness takes absolute precedence over avoiding actual strategic damage. But here's what makes this truly devastating, and why this moment will be studied in international relations courses for generations. Canada hasn't just won this particular standoff. Canada has accomplished something that will reshape how middle powers interact with the United States for decades to come. Not through confrontation or military posturing or dramatic gestures, but by making the United States unnecessary in Canada's long-term economic planning. Within 1 week, Canadian officials had initiated discussions to diversify energy exports, expand trade agreements with Europe and Asia, and help manufacturers reroute supply chains away from American dependence. You can't annex legitimacy. You can't force a sovereign nation to trust you after demonstrating that the relationship is subordinate to whatever serves domestic political theater. And in geopolitics, being made unnecessary is the most devastating outcome of all. It's worse than losing a direct confrontation because at least confrontation implies that your position and preferences still matter to the other party. What Canada has done is quietly, methodically, begin creating options that make American demands and American market access less essential than they were a week ago. That era is gone. The era where American market access was so overwhelmingly valuable that allies would absorb policy volatility and sovereignty subordination to maintain it is over. The modern global economy doesn't reward threats and ultimatums between developed democracies. It rewards reliability.